Hello everybody! Today we'll determine if women as a whole are eligible to vote. We shall engage this topic by first listening to the gentleman here lay down his case in the opening statement of this debate on the modern day debates. Link in the description. I must confess, I managed to listen up to about the 30th minute. It was a horrendous debate, one of the worst I've listened to. Mostly due to the lady's inability to properly address the main point. So let's do this man to man, shall we? Well, to be frank, I do not really care about debates. I use most of them as background noise for my work-related activities, but I do find it beneficial to discuss the concept of rights and obligations, women's rights included. Thus I shall neither limit myself to the US, which the male speaker is preoccupied with, apart from occasional forays into Europe and the West. Where have we heard that term before in similar contexts? Pray tell? Nor shall I choose to restrain myself from looking at a broader context. To keep this episode of The Answering within the bounds of reason, I'll play the man at double the original speed in full without interruption. No disrespect intended by this. Disrespect will come closer to the end of this video. If you want to transition to my part, feel free to skip to the 7th minute.
To start with, I'm going to give some descriptive truths about the world that aren't very fun to think about and don't align with the empathy-first mantra of modern feminists and so-called women's rights advocates. The way the world actually runs, when you reduce government function, nation-states, tribes, even down to the family level, is that we are a bunch of large, warring tribes who fight endlessly over resources. It is a never-ending fight, and it will never end. Sometimes we cooperate for the resources we want and gang up on tribes smaller than us, and sometimes we cooperate with smaller tribes to gang up on bigger ones. Fundamentally, this is what we were doing, though. Make no mistake about that. That is the world. In order to survive 4,000 years ago or 4 days ago, this truth was exactly the same. We find ourselves in an accepted people group and demographic and work cooperatively to defend and take resources. We find endless justifications for this, but in the end, after every emotional appeal is made and every justification exhausted, that is the world. When we discuss rights or women's liberation or even men's liberation or men's rights, it's important we understand contextually the way the world works to come up with good conclusions for how society should or even needs to be run. Every perceived right comes with great cost, which is why we should give rights out sparingly. They have no tangible existence, but are only concepts, and we should be very sparing with them. With the right to free speech, for instance, comes subversion as a side effect. The right to own a gun, there's going to be mass homicide shootings. No two ways about it. With the right to remain silent, the ability is there to literally get away with murder when coercive measures would have garnered a better outcome. However, these things will necessarily come with rights. To have them is to give people a concept to exploit malicious compliance, you could say. They can be used as quickly against people whose job it is to secure them as they can to liberate people from those who want to take them away. It's a double-edged sword. A nation needs to be healthy, not just economic prosperity, but spiritual and cultural health as well. An idea of belonging to something greater than you, and an idea of tying together bloodlines with strangers through shared interest in the preservation of joint values you care about, and would be willing to fight on behalf of that nation and people, and die for that nation if need be, to preserve that shared interest and bond you have with your countrymen. You do this because you believe that the very things you fought and died for will live on through your self-sacrifice of service to your nation and country. Women's liberation has turned the idea of such societies upside down. The values and structures which most Americans were willing to die on behalf of are completely gone. They've been totally eradicated. Society itself is totally inverted. Since first wave feminism and the push towards sexual revolution, then later the sexual revolution of the 60s, patriarchal systems have been summarily dismantled by women's liberation advocates, and Western society has pretty much been destroyed by the female vote. If we are to look at the anti-suffrage arguments, they read more like a series of prophecies than they do arguments. Let's go over them. One, anti-suffragists argued that voting and participation in government should be seen as a duty and not as a privilege. As we have seen women's participation in the processes of civil rights, almost everything is now seen as a privilege instead of a duty. Entire institutions are devoted to brainwashing the masses into the very idea that with the great duty of civil service and political enfranchisement, those enfranchised are privileged over those who are not, instead of the entire process being viewed as a serious duty, which should be taken seriously. Two, they argued women didn't need to assume this duty as it wouldn't address any problems which they actually faced. This also turned out to be completely correct. Feminism did not fulfill its promise and cannot fulfill its promise, and neither can women's liberation, because they necessarily always have to appeal to the enforcement class, which is men. The anti-suffragettes pointed this out, quote, "The basis of government," they said, "is physical force. It isn't law, but law enforcement, which protects society, and women cannot enforce laws even if they make them. That is still true to this day." This is an extremely pivotal argument from the anti-suffragettes because it creates a class system where women can make laws that then women themselves have no expectation to enforce. They can vote for wars that they themselves don't have to go fight, to create workplace standards for women, which men will have to enforce on their behalf. They can create standards for society that they themselves have no mechanism, absent men, to actually do anything about. Three, that women would lose their moral position in society if seen as a voting bloc to be appealed to. That's exactly what happened. Women before the idea of women's rights had moral NGO, non-government organizations, lobbying groups, highly effective in passing legislation on behalf of women's issues. One such was the 18th Amendment, which, as you might know, was passed before the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. The 18th Amendment, as you might know, was the outlaw of alcohol in the United States. That was passed primarily by women's advocacy groups. Four, the anti-suffragettes argued that, quote, "women can own property and cannot become impoverished by debt. Indeed, the laws used for the state that the husband had to provide for their wives via the power of the law itself and their families." Meaning, yeah, maybe women didn't have property, even though they did. Even under coverture laws, there was pre-assessed agreements where they had property negotiated by their fathers on their behalf. They also couldn't incur debt, though. No debt. And men had a financial obligation to support their family. They went to jail. They have no such laws on the books. Now, you can just abandon your family and go to jail. Five, anti-suffragettes argued that with this increased burden put on women, that this would erode the family unit. They argued it would divide household against themselves. Married people divided over politics, and families divided men and women over political concerns. That would divide the nation itself eventually, as women want to rule through empathy, and that is exactly what has occurred. Whole families divided by politics. Households divided by politics instead of a single household vote. Now there's two people who can be pitted against each other in the home. Women have been the key decisive vote for all leftist power institutions in the United States. Social decay caused by things like the destruction of the family unit and the rise of propaganda towards alternative family values has caused the West to literally implode. Birth rates aren't sustainable anywhere in the West. Nowhere. They are in consistent free fall and will continue to be. In its stead, women vote for things which cause further national disaster. LGBTQ marriage, trans issues, children transitioning, abortion, removal of conscription so they don't have to be conscripted for the sake of equality, mass migration policies. Women are the deciding vote on all of these things. Not only that, but the very idea of duties for women to the family, having a family, or moving society towards the propagation of family are soundly resisted at the women's institutional level. Huge welfare states, nanny states. They voted in Western countries. They vote in hate speech laws. They vote in tone policing laws. They vote for prostitution. They vote for smut. They vote for OnlyFans to be legal. They're the deciding vote on all of these issues. If it were the case that women didn't participate in the political system and instead were revered and protected as young women and respected as older matrons, how would that system be worse? What things are they losing? They would still have rights. They would still have female privilege. They did before there was a vote. Before they had the vote, they had rights. And we would still have a strong nation, which wasn't totally subverted by the feminine call for empathy on all issues. My opponent, hilariously enough, is a demonizer of Islam. I can respect that because they do worship a demon. But her ideas for women's liberation come from her view of a demonic religion. Once the West would be, this, by the way, is a religion the West would be quick to dispel if women weren't at the forefront, demanding hordes of Islamic immigrants be allowed into various Western nations in order to appease some stupid-ass idea of fairness and equality. This is battleground Earth. Islam has stated the womb is their weapon. They see the declining Western birth rates and rub their hands in glee. In 100 years, they may be in a position to put every Christian and Jew to the sword, and they probably will. Meanwhile, we worry about tone policing, abortions, and how to pay for women to outsource the care of their own children to strangers while they go to work. It's the most backwards, stupid fucking system I've ever heard of. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. With that, I'm happy to get into this. I can't put most everything in an opening, but this is a reasoned position. It's a viable position, and I'm tired of people pretending that it isn't. It's not a regressive society, as she says. Her progressive society has led to nothing but degeneracy and a deciding vote on the most horrible things you can think of. These women can vote right this second to send you at 18 years old to stab another man in the face with a bayonet, and they never have to be conscripted to go do the same thing. She says, well, what about property and the, women not being able to own property? Well, for one thing, most people didn't own property in early American history or in early history of any nation. But by the early 1800s, you can look it up yourself. By 1839, they could own property. It's ridiculous. We'd only been a constitutional republic for a few years. She's upset about these issues, but look how bad society looks under this. It's pretty awful. Wives were expected to be obedient. Oh my God, I can't. They were. Oh, wow, that's crazy.
Come up to the
She
10-minute
says,
mark.
I'm right there, right at the end. Would you just humor me with 30 more seconds, right at the end of this?
Molly,
Okay?
you good?
You good for 30 seconds? I'm almost done. Okay, same thing when she says, well, men got the custody of their children. Well, look at modern stats. Men do way better when they're the primary custodian of the child. Almost every metric, children do better when they have a single father rather than a single mother. It's almost like they knew what they were doing. She says women are outperforming men. They're not outperforming men. Yeah, they get more college degrees, that's true, but they get them in STEM. They've been regressing from STEM. It's been stagnated for the last 10 years, and in many nations, it's regressing the opposite way. They get it in healthcare, nursing, and psychology.
Run through that
All right,
last 30 seconds.
I'm good.
Regarding the worldview of warring tribes and struggles for resources, I have no qualms with that. So rights, as any other higher-order societal function, is a cultural artifact. Same as anything else we've built atop our natural makeup. That is a sort of a phenotype. Now, the enforcement of rights. The simple truth is, anybody can pretty easily take away almost anybody's so-called right to live, for example. Once being a man does give one an edge over an average woman in a so-called fair fight, but humans are immensely fragile, and very few are going to defy the other's rights in this highly controlled manner. That's an individualistic example, for sure, which will do for an opening to the topic. Well, deviants are always there, and we have law enforcement to contain them, for crying out loud. And that is true, but we also need to consider that said law enforcement is never enough to contain an actual large-scale outburst of violence. There would be a preponderance of males in such an outburst, certainly, but the point is, societies are based on a shaky principled consensus as to what the rights and norms are. Your rights, sir, are no different from a woman's rights in this sense. There is no homogeneous enforcement class. The enforcement class is whatever we allow it to be. Speaking of defending a nation, it's a way more complicated thing than fighting at the front line. It is indispensable that a fighting force strong and capable enough be there to defend a nation, and it also follows from the facts of human physiology that the tip of the spear tearing through the enemy's flesh be forged from mighty and valiant men. But first of all, a fair portion of women prove to be quite capable on the battlefield, which means we get more warriors, not less. Secondly, there are multiple supporting roles, some in the proximity of the contact line, some further away, which are not dependent on one's sex in the slightest. Thirdly, with the war raging on, there are other things to do as well, to preserve whatever's left of life away from the battlefield, for, believe it or not, soldiers wish to return to a warm hearth, not a cold ruin. Keep businesses running, keep schools open, keep banks operating, keep importing and exporting goods, keep the streets clean, keep building and rebuilding, keep preserving and propagating our culture, and yes, care for children. Those who can fight ought to fight and be revered as such, granting their families special station through their military glory. This is the only special class there ought to be, and most men in most nations are not part of it. And membership in this class is most definitely not earned by producing sperm or by talking shit. It's earned by shedding blood. Speaking of culture, This is something you first get with your mother's milk. The songs sung to you, the fairy tales told, the first lessons learned. The values which root one into one's nation's context come to a great extent from one's mother. Why must it be, then, that a person who contributes to the nation's bloodline lasting through the ages has no say in what the nation's course needs to be? Even if we consider strict splitting of responsibilities into, let's say, creating and nourishing new life and securing the environment wherein this new life is brought up, which brushes over a multitude of aspects of our lives, I fail to see how the split leads to one task being the lesser of the two unless your worldview is warped by constant anticipation of violence. And yeah, how is it that only one role is worthy of full citizenship while people in both roles fulfill their duties eludes me. And if one appeals to many women choosing not to procreate, it is in no way different under this imposed frame of reference to many men not fighting a war. There seems to be a false dichotomy going on as well, that of men and women being some kind of semi-discrete groups opposed one to another. Aspects of governance are at best tertiary to the clan, the family, which one would be affiliated with by right of birth. A far deeper kind of connection, augmented by ties of friendship forming a foundation for mutual support and mutual interest. Unless one is indoctrinated into a particular religious or political dogma, it would seem natural to advance the interests of those groups, and by extension, following from a broader cultural context, and when it does not contradict one's immediate identity, that of one's compatriots, bound together by shared duties and privileges into a nation. In this broader societal and political context, one indeed must on occasion lay aside this or that part of one's immediate interest for the preservation of the whole. To affiliate oneself in this regard with a group defined exclusively or mostly by one's sex borders on insanity. That is what dogma brings you. Now, family. If this or that gay person, being open about their preference, is a detriment to your family values are not worth shit. This is even more true in regard to a family torn apart by a divergent voting preference. If such petty concerns disentangle the relationships you have thus far built, I'd say let it fall apart and serve as a clear demonstration of what it means to lack respect for your kin, to lack filial piety, to lack parental love, to lack wisdom. Now, obedience. If you earn respect from a person, you will get obedience in the form of cooperation, and you will reap more than you have sown. Slave labor is less efficient, you know. If that is what you earn for, you can find plenty of women willing to own nothing, earn nothing, and be in your service. Please keep your fetishes to yourself, because they are starting to look more like fear of women hijacking whatever authority you could scrape together, hiding behind the slogan of protecting the young women and respecting the matrons. Same as men, women can change and combine the roles they play throughout their lives. A mother, a daughter, a wife, an employee, an employer, a politician, a housewife, the list goes on. Somehow, many women choosing to work in the non-technical spheres is supposed to undermine their right to vote. Even so, they're a rather noticeable minority in STEM activities. What relevance does this have? If one day more women will be in those fields, will that influence the worldview of the likes of yourself? I dare assume not, because it's based on a particular interpretation of Christianity, which you made perfectly clear. Now, the ancients thought that changing the vision of the social order passed down to them from their forefathers should bring forth calamity by contaminating the nation. In this sense, excluding women from political process is not much different from isolating them when they are menstruating or have just given birth. Another statement, that is the religious basis which is to be seen after we've blown away all the chaff of your learned talk of statistics. Sometimes the ancients erred. To preserve tradition is not to preserve folly, it is to preserve that which establishes continuity of, I dare say, the spirit. This is how you venerate your forebears. You, on the contrary, seem quite similar to the Muslims you hate, at least to a person not bound to the Christian doctrine. yet quite aware of what it means typically to be orthodox as a Christian. Constantly a victim battling the forces of decay, yet unable to address specific detrimental issues, like, say, administering puberty blockers to children, and going for the most hardcore subversive insanity which is conveniently embellished by Christian-like platitudes. I think you in the USA ought to pay more attention to your own politics, as having more men than women vote in an absolutely cartoonish, villainous and degenerate oligarchy does not work quite well to point to men being worthy of an exclusive right to political duties, in particular the evangelicals. Imagine coping with SJW irritants by ushering in the loudest and most puerile populists with little to no regard for your actual well-being. Manly redefined. So to wrap it up, I should like to allude to Plato's quite progressive view of letting women do what they're capable of doing, be it craftsmanship or war, without disregard to the importance of raising a new generation of capable people, though I do not really agree with his communal approach to the latter. That's a classical breaker of families for you. So let me get a little bit more personal here. As a citizen of a country at war, I see certain things as threats to my nation. Russian barbarians, to name the biggest of them, namely their soldiers trying to kill, rape and torture those I care for and support, their missiles and drones, some of which inconvenience my neighborhood with their presence, and their propaganda, having corrupted for years both the Russian populace and to an extent some of my own compatriots. And you, dear concerned Westerners, a lion's share of the said propaganda is not without a reason recognized by certain so-called conservative Christians in your hemisphere, should I name them, as representing traditional, quote-unquote, values. I do not wish to impose this specific love of barbarians on you, as I don't know your view on this, dear sir, but the values you stand for, the ones voiced in the video, I too consider a threat. Being quite removed from what the so-called conservatives in the US conventionally label a liberal, I do not see the native Muslim populace in my country, for instance, as a threat. We can usually find a common ground as compatriots. But I do see that which you preach as a major internal threat to the survival of the Western civilization. Even more so than the inability of many European countries to enforce their laws properly in regard to the refugees resisting assimilation. Thus I think nothing major will happen if an odd citizen makes his body closer to the opposite sex, or gays hold a parade now and then, no more infuriating than Christians blocking traffic with their church processions. Or even, oh horror, some woman aborts a half-formed fetus on occasion, though I'm not a fan. But quite an unacceptable thing to my mind will happen if those I stand for, be it males or females, are deprived of both their duties and privileges by people enamored with violence. You people, and I don't mean any religious or political group as a whole, for I do not dwell in absolutes, are the corruption eating at the elan vital of our civilization, urging us to fester in the folly of our ancestors, instead of expanding what glorious things they brought forth, our philosophy, our sciences, our arts and humanities, and eventually, too, their belated awareness that the female type of human is quite deserving of the full scope of citizenship, albeit its role might at times differ from the male one. And that surprisingly, not suppressing it will not make one less of a man. So, if this malaise you bear in your heart calling it a cure happens to take root here, those of us who care for our nation's wives and sisters shall be forced to seize the parasite spreading it. And it won't be just men participating in this violence. I promise. That's it. Have a nice day, y'all.